2 years of silence. 2 years of pretending the best thing that ever happened to him was something he could simply walk away from. And then, one afternoon in the most expensive jewelry boutique in Seoul, Kang Do-hyun saw her again, his ex-wife, standing 3 feet away, laughing at something another man had just whispered in her ear. He had a ring to buy, for someone else. So did she, in a way. And every carefully constructed wall he had spent 2 years building came down in about 4 seconds. If this story already has its hooks in you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The rain came down hard that afternoon in Gangnam, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself. It just arrived, sudden and indifferent, soaking everything before anyone had the sense to move. Nia Brooks was already 3 blocks from the boutique when it started, and by the time she ducked under the narrow awning of a flower shop that had already closed for the day, her silk blouse was half translucent and her heels had taken on water. She didn't panic, she laughed. That was the thing about Nia. She laughed at inconvenience the way other people cursed at it. She tipped her face up toward the water rushing off the awning's edge and shook her head like the sky had pulled a rude joke on her personally, and then she started digging through her bag for the umbrella she already knew wasn't there. It wasn't there. She laughed again. That was when Kang Do-hyun first saw her. He'd been walking past with his driver 3 steps behind him and his mind 3 floors above him, already turning over the numbers from a meeting that had run 40 minutes long and produced nothing useful. He walked in the rain without urgency. His suit was worth more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore it the way other men wore old jeans, like it meant nothing, like getting it wet was simply not a category of problem he dealt with. He had an umbrella. He wasn't using it. He noticed her the way a man notices a fire in a window on a street of dark buildings. Not aggressively, not with any particular plan. He simply stopped walking and looked at her. This woman standing under a flower shop awning with soaked silk against her collarbone and a laugh aimed at the rain like it owed her an apology. She was black, American, the kind of beautiful that didn't require context or translation. Her locks were pushed back from her face and water was catching in them. Her bag was open and completely useless. She was by any practical measure stranded. He walked to her. He didn't say anything. He just held the umbrella over her head. She looked at him for a moment, not suspicious, not immediately charmed, just calibrating. Then she said, "You're getting wet." "I know," he said. She looked at the umbrella, then at him, then at the umbrella again. "That's generous and also kind of absurd." "Yes," he said. She almost smiled. "You always this quiet?" "Usually," he said. That was how it started. Not with a grand gesture or a manufactured moment, with rain and a man who didn't explain himself, and a woman who laughed at things that weren't funny, and 4 words that turned out to be somehow the beginning of everything. That was 6 years ago. Nia stood in the middle of Maison Éclat, the most brutally expensive jewelry boutique in all of Seoul, all clean white marble and glass cases lit from below like shrines to small beautiful things, and tried to focus on the necklace the sales associate was holding up for her consideration. It was a piece she'd seen in their catalog 3 weeks ago. Hammered gold links, asymmetric, conceptually interesting. The kind of thing that worked in the high-end residential spaces she designed for a living. She'd been planning this visit since Tuesday. She was not thinking about the necklace. Malik Thompson had his hand at the small of her back, not pressing, just present. His particular way of communicating that he was there, that he was paying attention, that he was, as always, steady. He was handsome in an architectural way, sharp jaw and clear eyes, and a manner so composed that being near him sometimes felt like standing next to a well-designed building. Everything in the right place. Nothing unnecessary. "What do you think?" he asked her. "It's good," she said. "I think it's good." "You've been staring at it for 4 minutes." "I stare at things when I'm deciding." "You decided the last 3 things in under 30 seconds. She picked up the necklace from the velvet tray and turned it over in her fingers. It was cold and heavier than it looked. She was about to say something. She didn't know what, something true and ordinary, when she heard the door. It was nothing remarkable. A boutique door opening, the soft pneumatic exhale of temperature-controlled air. the click of expensive heels on marble. But something in her chest went cold before she even turned around. She turned around. Kang Do-hyun stood at the entrance. He was wearing a charcoal suit and no expression, the way he always wore both, like the suit was armor, and the absence of expression was the weapon. He'd gotten marginally sharper in 2 years. The lines around his eyes had settled into something more permanent. His jaw was set at the angle she used to read like a language, back when she'd had enough access to learn it. He hadn't seen her yet. She had maybe 3 seconds before he did. She turned back to the glass case and set the necklace down very carefully, as though any sudden movement might cause something to break. "You okay?" Malik asked quietly. "Fine," she said. It was not fine. But Do-hyun saw her approximately 4 seconds after he walked in. He knew because his body registered her before his mind processed the information. A kind of stuttering in his chest, a microsecond interruption in his breathing that he hadn't experienced since the last time he'd been genuinely afraid of something. He wasn't a man who was afraid of much. But Nia Brooks, standing 12 feet away from him in a jewelry boutique he had specifically chosen for its discretion and its distance from the parts of Seoul she typically worked in. He stopped walking. His assistant, Park Jae-won, took 1 step and nearly walked into his back. "Sir?" Do-hyun didn't answer. He looked at her. She had her back to him now, which meant she'd already seen him, which meant she was doing what she always did when something hit too close. She went completely still and faced the other direction and waited for the discomfort to resolve itself. He'd always hated that about her. He'd also always understood it perfectly because he did the exact same thing. The man beside her was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of steady physical presence that came from a person who'd never once had to question whether they belonged somewhere. He had his hand on Nia's back, a small, comfortable gesture that landed in Do-hyun's chest like something with weight. He exhaled once, slowly, and walked to the counter. A different sales associate materialized. "Welcome to Maison Éclat. How can I—" "Engagement rings," Do-hyun said. "Something in round brilliant, clean setting, not elaborate." "Of course, if you'll follow me—" He followed and did not look at her again. He looked at her again. What? Yoon Seo-ah arrived 11 minutes later, which Do-hyun knew because he'd been watching the door with a discipline that appalled him. She came in from the light rain outside, small and precise. Her umbrella already folded, her coat already spotless. She was beautiful in the way a well-composed photograph was beautiful. Everything calibrated. She kissed his cheek and looked at the tray of rings he'd been reviewing and said, "These are lovely." And he nodded and felt nothing except a specific, exhausting guilt. He watched Seo-ah from the corner of his awareness the way he watched most things, tracking exits and variables. She was kind. She was intelligent. She had been, for the past 8 months, remarkably patient with a man who was fundamentally not available in the ways she deserved. He knew this. He had known it for a while. Knowing it had not made him stop. Across the room, Nia's new partner had produced his phone and was showing her something on the screen, and she was leaning in to look at it, and her shoulder was against his arm. Do-hyun picked up a ring from the tray. "Put it down." "That one has exceptional clarity," the associate said. "Sure," Do-hyun said. Nia heard the second door. She knew it was the girlfriend before she even looked. There was a logic to it, an awful symmetry. Of course he had someone. 2 years was long enough. She'd moved on, hadn't she? She was here with Malik. She had been, for the past 5 months, genuinely content. Not passionately content, not the kind of content that kept her up at night in the good way, but content in the solid, trustworthy sense that she had come to value. She looked. The woman was Korean, quietly stunning, wearing a coat that probably cost what Nia charged for a preliminary design consultation. She walked to Do-hyun with the easy confidence of a woman who knew her position and felt comfortable in it. He didn't transform when she arrived. Do-hyun never transformed, never softened visibly, never performed warmth for an audience. But he turned toward her, and something in the angle of his body shifted in the direction of accommodation. Nia faced the glass case. "I think the necklace," she said to Malik. "I think we go with the necklace." "You sure?" "Yes." She was not sure about anything. The catastrophe happened at the counter. It was the sales manager's fault, technically. The woman had misread the situation entirely, had seen two well-dressed couples in her boutique on a slow Thursday, and had made the executive decision to introduce them, perhaps imagining this was the kind of establishment where that sort of thing was done, where souls wealthy moved in overlapping circles and appreciated being connected. "Mr. Kang," she said, smiling with perfect professional warmth, "I believe you and Ms. Brooks may have some mutual connections in the design world. Ms. Brooks just completed the interior renovation of the Hyatt Tower, and I know your hotel group has been—" Do-hyun's expression did not change. Nia turned from the register. For one full second, they looked at each other directly for the first time in 2 years. She looked older, not in a diminishing way, in the way of a person who had lived inside their own life and let it mark them. Her locks were longer. There was something in her face that had shifted from the person he remembered, something settled and self-possessed that he couldn't name exactly and couldn't stop looking at. She looked at him the way she used to when he'd said something careless, that specific contained expression that meant she was deciding how much of what she actually thought to give him. "We know each other," Nia said to the sales manager. Her voice was perfectly level. "Thank you." The manager blinked, recalibrated. "Of course, We're married," Do-hyun said. A beat. "Were," Nia said. "We were married." Another beat. Malik looked at Do-hyun. Do-hyun looked at nothing in particular, which was how he looked at things he was actively choosing not to engage with. Seo looked at Nia with the expression of a person assembling a puzzle in real time. Nia looked at Malik, who had gone very still in the composed architectural way of his, and said quietly, "Malik, this is Do-hyun. We were married for 3 years. We've been divorced for 2. She paused. "Do-hyun, this is Malik Thompson. He's an architect. We've been together for 5 months." Do-hyun looked at Malik for one moment. "Kang Do-hyun," he said. He did not extend his hand immediately. Then he did. They shook. "Malik Thompson," Malik said. He was measuring, but discreet about it. A man who knew how to move through uncertain rooms. Seo introduced herself with more grace than the situation deserved. Her name landed in the air, and Nia received it with a nod that managed to be both polite and completely uninformative. For approximately 90 seconds, all 4 of them stood in this boutique surrounded by illuminated cases of diamonds and gold and made conversation. The sales manager had retreated. The associates were finding reasons to be elsewhere. Nia commented on Seo's coat. Seo asked about Nia's design work with the kind of genuine curiosity that was somehow worse than false interest. Malik asked Do-hyun about his hotel group in the way one professional acknowledges another's field. Do-hyun answered in the clipped, precise way he answered everything, accurate, minimal, offering nothing beyond what was asked. Their smiles were immaculate. The room was a contained disaster. They left first, Nia and Malik. She completed the purchase of the necklace in less time than it had taken to decide on it, signed the receipt without looking at the figure, and walked toward the door with the measured pace of a woman who was absolutely not fleeing. Malik held the door. Outside, the rain had lightened to something misty and directionless. Nia walked 2 steps onto the pavement and stopped. "You all right?" Malik asked. "Give me a second." He gave her a second. He gave her several. This was one of the things about Malik. He understood that some silences needed to be occupied. "I didn't know he'd be there," she said. "I know. I haven't seen him in 2 years." "I know, Nia." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with those clear eyes that never performed an emotion they didn't genuinely contain. There was no accusation in his face. There was something quieter than that, something that looked like recognition, like a man gently filing a piece of information into an understanding he'd been building for a while. "It was fine," she said. "We're fine." Malik nodded. "We are," he said. And the way he said it, present tense, steady, but with a slight emphasis that meant he'd heard what she wasn't saying, made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with Do-hyun and everything to do with what she owed Malik that she wasn't sure she could deliver. She turned away from the boutique and started walking, and did not look back. Do-hyun and Seo remained inside for another 8 minutes. She chose a ring, not the one he'd been examining when she arrived, but a different one, simpler, which was what she preferred, and he watched the associate box it and thought about nothing that was happening in front of him. On the drive back, Seoa sat beside him and looked out the window at Seoul sliding past in the rain. She had a phone in her hand but wasn't using it. "How long were you married?" she asked. 3 years. "And divorced for 2. "Yes." A pause. "You never told me her name," Seoa said. "Nia," he said. Seoa was quiet. Then, "She's beautiful." Do-hyun didn't answer. "She looked at you the way people look at something they used to know by heart," Seoa said. Her voice was even. She wasn't performing devastation. She was making an observation, and making it clearly the way she did most things. It was one of the qualities he admired in her and had used, he understood now with uncomfortable clarity, as a substitute for the less comfortable qualities he'd been avoiding in himself. "So, I'm not upset," she said. "I'm just noting it." He let the silence stand. "Did you love her?" Seoa asked. The car moved through the rain. Seoul's lights were beginning to come on in the early dusk, neon smearing against wet glass. Do-hyun looked out the window for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Do you still?" He didn't answer, which was, of course, an answer. Seoa looked back out of her window and said nothing else. She held the boxed ring in her lap like something she wasn't sure what to do with. Do-hyun watched the city and thought about nothing and thought about everything and felt the particular, specific misery of a man who had made a correct decision once in his life and then spent 2 years convincing himself he hadn't. He was 17 when he understood what his family was, not in the abstract. He'd known the shape of it before that, in the way children of powerful families know that certain conversations stop when they enter a room, that certain visitors arrive after midnight, that their father's name produces a specific quality of silence in people who know it well. He'd grown up inside that silence the way a plant grows inside a wall, finding light through cracks and not questioning the architecture of the structure holding it. At 17, he watched his father make a decision that ended a man's life. Not personally. Kang Tae-sung was not a man who used his own hands for anything so coarse, but he issued the order in the same tone he used to ask for more tea. And 3 days later, a name stopped appearing in conversations, and Do-hyun understood that the wall he'd been growing inside was not a wall. It was a machine, and he was being trained to run it. He chose to run it well. This was the decision he'd made at 17 that every subsequent decision had been built on. If the machine was going to run regardless of his participation, it was better to run it with intelligence and discipline than to abdicate and let something worse take over. He told himself this so many times it had become indistinguishable from belief. What he hadn't accounted for was Nia. She had arrived in his life at 31, during a period when the legitimate side of his holdings, hotels, real estate development, a private equity arm, had grown large enough that he could spend most of his time in boardrooms rather than the other rooms. He'd been managing a careful, deliberate transition, making the machine smaller, building the clean businesses large enough to eventually make the other parts unnecessary. He hadn't told Nia any of this. He hadn't told her because explaining it required explaining what he was transitioning from, and explaining that required a level of trust he didn't know how to extend to another person. He'd grown up in a world where the wrong information in the wrong hands was the mechanism by which everything collapsed. Trust was not something you offered. It was something you withheld until there was absolute, incontrovertible proof that offering it was safe. He had never found that proof with anyone. He had come the closest with Nia, and then in trying to protect her from the parts of himself he was ashamed of, he had hidden the parts of himself she needed to love, and she had responded to his silence with silence of her own. And their marriage had become a place where 2 people lived in careful parallel and called it partnership. And one ordinary Tuesday, she had left a set of papers on the kitchen counter, and he had signed them because he hadn't known how to say what signing them actually felt like. He'd thought about it only once since then. Once, directly. In the way he thought about things he had decided to deal with and then chose not to. It was 4 months after the divorce, 3 in the morning, a glass of scotch he hadn't finished. He'd looked at the city from his apartment and thought with clarity, "I threw away the only good thing." Then he'd put the thought away and not taken it out again. Until today. Nia got back to her studio at 6:15. Her studio occupied the fourth floor of a building in Iriwan that she'd spent 18 months negotiating the lease for, and another 6 making into something that reflected the way she thought about space. Light from the north windows, materials that were honest about what they were. No false ceilings, nothing that pretended to be something it wasn't. It was the place she felt most like herself. She dropped her bag on the long work table and stood in the middle of the floor and didn't move. Dolores, her office manager, appeared from around the partition that separated the reception area from the main studio space. She was 61, Korean-American, completely immune to Nia's moods. The Lotte client called again about the color specification for the third-floor lobby. "I'll call them tomorrow." "You said that yesterday." "Then I'll call them tomorrow," with the added conviction of someone who said it twice. Dolores looked at her for a moment. "What happened?" "Nothing." "You're standing in the middle of the room without your coat." Nia looked down. She was still wearing her coat. "I'm wearing my coat." "Your shoes." She looked down again. She'd taken them off at the door. She was standing in her stockings on the concrete floor she'd had poured to a specific aggregate she'd sourced from 3 different suppliers. "Ran into someone," she said. Dolores waited. "My ex-husband." Another wait. "Was it bad?" Dolores asked. Nia thought about the boutique, the lit cases, the 4 of them standing in the immaculate, expensive air. His face, which had not changed. His face, which had changed completely. "He was buying an engagement ring," she said. Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "For someone else." "Yes," Nia said. "For someone else." Dolores went to the small kitchen counter along the wall and began making tea without asking whether Nia wanted any. Nia walked to her work table and sat down and opened her laptop and stared at a project file she didn't read. After a while, she said, "He introduced himself to Malik." "He met Malik?" The 4 of us stood there for 90 seconds, being completely civilized. She paused. "His girlfriend is Korean. She's beautiful. She was wearing a coat that probably cost 6 million won. She asked me about my work like she actually cared about the answer." "That sounds awful." "It was incredibly awful," Nia said. "It was the most awful thing I've experienced in 2 years, and I've had 3 clients try to cut my fee in half, and one of them cried." Dolores set a mug on the table near her elbow. Nia wrapped her hands around it. "Are you okay?" Dolores asked. "I'm fine," Nia said. "I'm completely fine. I'm fine." She was saying it the way she sometimes said measurements to herself when she was working, repetition as verification. "It was just a moment. It doesn't mean anything." "Okay," Dolores said. "It was 2 years ago. I moved on." "I know." "Malik is—" She stopped. Dolores didn't fill in the pause. "Malik is good," Nia said. "He's really good." "He is," Dolores said, and there was nothing in her voice except the truth of it, which somehow made it worse. Nia stared at the project file. "I just didn't expect him to look—" She stopped again. "Look what?" She shook her head. She wasn't going to finish that sentence. She wasn't going to say he looked the same, because he didn't look the same. He looked older and harder, and in some way that she couldn't name and didn't want to examine. He looked more like himself than he ever had during their marriage, as though 2 years of absence had stripped away whatever performance he'd been maintaining and left just the actual architecture of him. And the actual architecture was— She closed that thought like a door. "I should call the Lotte client," she said. "It's 6:30. "Tomorrow, then." "That's what I've been saying." She nodded and stared at the file, and thought about rain and flower shops and a man with an umbrella who never explained himself, and felt, in the quiet studio with the north-facing light dying out, and the city coming on below, the particular ache of something that had healed wrong. Not broken, not destroyed, but knit back together at an angle that announced itself every time the weather changed. He called his attorney at 7. Not about the rings, or about COA, or about anything personal, about a property negotiation in Busan that was scheduled for the following week. He called because calling about the property negotiation was something concrete and actionable, and it required him to be the version of himself that functioned in the world without friction. Park Jae-won, who had been his assistant for 5 years and had developed an almost clinical ability to monitor his employer's atmospheric pressure, set a folder on his desk at 7:20 and said, without looking up, The Jeju Development Report. Leave it. You asked for it yesterday. Leave it. Chaewon left it. He also quietly poured a glass of water and set it near the Scotch decanter, a move so subtle it couldn't be acknowledged without acknowledging why it had been made. Do-hyun sat in his office after Chaewon left and looked at the city. He thought about what Seoa had said. She's beautiful. She looked at you the way people look at something they used to know by heart. He thought about the necklace Nia had bought, hammered gold, asymmetric, the kind of piece she chose for itself rather than for its value. The kind of choice that was so specifically her that seeing it had felt like a small, private wound. He thought about the man beside her. Malik Thompson, architect, composed and measured and clearly capable of being present in a way that Do-hyun had spent 3 years of marriage demonstrating he was not. He thought about the morning she had left. Not dramatically, not in tears or in anger. They'd moved past those by then, down to the quieter, more total devastation of two people who had run out of ways to reach each other and had started simply waiting for the other to go. She'd packed 2 bags, which was not enough for everything she owned. She'd come back for the rest the following week, when he'd been in Tokyo. She'd left the apartment key on the counter next to the papers, and she'd left the small terracotta pot of herbs she'd kept on the kitchen windowsill because she'd said he needed something alive in the apartment, and he should learn to water it. He'd killed the herbs in 3 weeks. He hadn't thrown the pot away. He didn't examine why. He didn't examine most things in his personal life with the same unflinching precision he applied to business decisions, because examining them produced outcomes he had no operational response to. Tonight, sitting in his office with the Jeju report unopened and the Scotch untouched, he let himself examine it. She had been the only person who had ever demanded his actual presence rather than his performance. Every other relationship in his life, his family, his business associates, the men who feared him, the ones who wanted to use him, they all responded to the performance. The stillness, the control, the cold precision. They read it as power, and they oriented themselves around it. Nia had looked right through it from the beginning, not aggressively, not as a challenge, simply because she was constitutionally incapable of engaging with a surface and calling it a person. She'd asked him questions no one asked him. She'd sat with his silences and refused to fill them in on his behalf. She'd pushed on the edges of his walls not to break them, but to find out if there was a door, and when he'd refused to show her one, she'd stopped looking, not because she'd given up, but because she'd exhausted herself trying. He had watched her stop trying and told himself it was acceptable. That distance was safety. That keeping her outside his most dangerous truths was protection. He understood now, with the clarity that came from looking at things from 2 years away, that it had been none of those things. It had been cowardice. The realization didn't produce anything dramatic in him. He wasn't a man given to dramatic internal weather. It settled instead into the specific, functional form of all his most important understandings. Clear, complete, actionable. Actionable. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again. He still had her number. He'd never deleted it, which was, he told himself, on the 2 or 3 occasions he'd noticed it still there. Simply an oversight, the kind of administrative negligence that accumulates when a man's contacts list runs to several hundred entries. It was not an oversight. He put the phone face down on the desk. He picked up the Jeju report. He read 3 pages and retained nothing. Outside, Seoul continued its evening in full, indifferent, luminous progress. Somewhere in Itaewon, a woman in a studio with north-facing windows was probably sitting at a work table with a mug of tea, staring at a project file she wasn't reading, and not thinking about him. He told himself that. He was not entirely convinced. Look, Nia didn't sleep well. She lay in her apartment, the one she'd found and furnished herself, the one that was entirely hers, with none of the accumulated compromises of shared spaces, and stared at the ceiling and listened to rain against the window, which had started again sometime after midnight with the persistent patience of something that had no schedule to keep. She had dated 3 people in 2 years. The first 2 had been brief, exploratory, the kind of relationship that functions as proof of concept, proof that she could do this, that she was a person who was still in motion, who hadn't calcified in the aftermath of the marriage. They'd been fine. They'd ended without grief. Malik was different. Malik she had actually let in, actually given access to her daily life, to her work anxieties and her travel schedule, and the particular way she needed a Saturday morning to feel. He was good. He was present. He was everything she had told herself she needed after Do Hyun. Steady instead of volatile, open instead of closed, a man who said what he felt instead of building architecture around it. She was not sure she loved him. She wasn't not sure either. That was the thing. That particular middle ground that she'd been occupying for 5 months, telling herself was just the healthy, adult, unsentimental version of love rather than its absence. She turned onto her side. She thought about the way Do Hyun had looked at her in the boutique. Not warmly. He didn't do warmth in public, never had, probably never would. But with a specific attention that she'd spent 3 years learning to read and 2 years trying to forget. Like she was something he was assessing the structural integrity of. Like he was doing math. She thought about Seoa's coat, the ring tray, the terrible pristine 90 seconds. She thought about the drive home when Malik had held her hand across the center console and asked her, quietly, no drama, no accusation, whether she wanted to talk. She'd said no. He'd said okay. He'd kept holding her hand. She closed her eyes. In 6 hours, she had a client meeting. The latte lobby still needed a color specification. There was a sourcing call with a craftsman in Busan she'd been pushing for 3 weeks. Her life was full, properly full, the way she'd built it to be. A practice she was proud of, a city she'd made her home, a future she could see the shape of. She just couldn't always see herself inside it with complete clarity. The rain kept on. She pulled the covers up and told herself firmly that tomorrow was a workday and yesterday was already gone. And one encounter in a jewelry boutique did not constitute a crisis. And this was simply the ordinary psychic weather of running into someone from your past. Anyone from your past. And it would fade by morning. She almost believed it. Then she thought about rain and a flower shop awning and a man who'd stood in a downpour so a stranger could stay dry. And she pressed her face into the pillow and felt something in her chest. Do something she hadn't given it permission to do. Something that felt exactly like the particular and specific ache of a door that was supposed to be sealed, swinging quietly in the dark, all the way open. He sent the text at 11:17 the next morning. He'd drafted it 4 times and deleted it 3. The final version was 8 words. You were always better at talking than I was. He stared at it for 40 seconds. Then he sent it and locked his phone and put it in his desk drawer and picked up a report on the Busan property and read the same paragraph 6 times in a row. 43 minutes later, his phone buzzed. He took it out of the drawer. Her response was 6 words. That's a low bar. You okay? He looked at that for a long time. The you okay was so specifically Naya. Not how are you, not an opening for a conversation, but a direct, unadorned check-in that cut through all the possible performances to the actual question. He typed, no. He stared at that. He deleted it and typed, I wanted to apologize for the situation yesterday. That wasn't... He deleted that too. He typed, can we... He held the phone. He put it back in the drawer. He took it back out. This was... And he recognized it with some combination of exhaustion and dark amusement, the first time in his adult life that Kang Do-hyun, who had negotiated with men who would have happily killed him, who had restructured an entire criminal organization into a legitimate empire through calculated patience and the willingness to play long games that most people couldn't see the shape of, was genuinely uncertain how to proceed with a 10-word text exchange. He typed, can we talk? Not about yesterday. About what we didn't say before that. He held it. He sent it. He put the phone face down on the desk and picked up the Busan report and got through half a page before his phone buzzed. He turned it over. Her text sat on the screen for him to read. I'm in the middle of something, she'd written. But yes, I think we probably should. And then, after a pause that he could almost feel across the city, Do-hyun. Why now? He looked at that question. He picked up his pen and put it down. Why now? Because I walked into a room and saw you laughing with someone else and felt something I thought I'd successfully amputated. Because you looked at me like I was a structure you used to know the load-bearing points of, and you couldn't quite remember which walls were weight-bearing and which were for show. Because Seoa asked me if I still loved you and I couldn't answer her, which is the closest I have ever come in my adult life to honesty. He typed, Because I'm tired of carrying the wrong version of the story. He sent it, looked at it on the screen, waited. Her response came 4 minutes later, which meant she'd read it and sat with it rather than reacting immediately, which was new. The Nia he'd been married to had reacted to things with her whole body before her mind caught up, quick and feeling forward. And the fact that she'd paused meant something had changed in her, meant she'd built something in herself in these 2 years that he hadn't known about and couldn't account for. It meant she'd grown in a direction he hadn't been there to see. The text read, "So have I. I'll be in touch." He set the phone down. Outside his window, Seoul moved through its mid-morning in the gray, rain-washed light of an ordinary Thursday that had just become something else entirely. He didn't know what exactly. He didn't have the data yet for a full assessment. What he knew was this. Somewhere across this city, in a studio with north-facing light, the woman he had spent 2 years pretending not to think about had just told him she'd be in touch. And for the first time in a long time, he had no walls ready. He wasn't sure, sitting there in the silence of his office with the Busan report open and unread before him, whether the absence of walls was the most dangerous thing that had happened to him in years, or whether it was the first honest moment he'd had since the last time it rained in Gangnam. Nia didn't respond to his last text for 3 days. Not because she didn't know what to say, she knew exactly what she wanted to say, and that was precisely the problem. The words were right there, fully formed, sitting in her chest like something she'd accidentally swallowed whole, and every time she picked up her phone and opened the thread and looked at his 8 words, "Because I'm tired of carrying the wrong version of the story," she felt the specific, unwelcome sensation of a person standing at an edge they told themselves wasn't there. So she worked. She put in 11-hour days on the Lotte Lobby project and finally called the color specification through on Friday morning and answered 17 emails she'd been sitting on and drove out to a site visit in Mapo on Saturday and came home with concrete dust on her boots and a headache she hadn't earned through any legitimate means. She had dinner with Malik on Friday night. He cooked. He was a better cook than her, which had always been one of the quietly disarming things about him. And they sat across from each other in his apartment with its clean lines and its thoughtful lighting, and she ate the food and talked about work and felt, the entire time, like a woman performing the role of herself to an audience of one. He didn't push. He never pushed. That was the thing about Malik that she'd initially read as emotional generosity and was now beginning to read as something else. Not withholding, but a kind of careful tending, like a man who'd decided early on that the way to hold Nia Brooks was to give her room and wait. It wasn't wrong. It was, in fact, probably correct. It just wasn't enough anymore, and that realization sat in her gut like something with teeth. Sunday morning, she was at her kitchen table with coffee and her laptop and a sourcing document she was supposed to review when her phone lit up with a name she hadn't heard from in 8 months. Ji-young. She and Choi Ji-young had been friends since Nia's first year in Seoul, bonded over bad translation apps and a shared contempt for spaces that prioritized aesthetics over function. Ji-young was a curator at a private gallery in Hanam-dong, sharp and direct, and constitutionally incapable of tact in a way Nia had always found refreshing. She was also, incidentally, one of the 3 people in Seoul who had known both Nia and Do-hyun during the marriage. "I heard," Ji-young said before Nia could say anything. "Good morning to you too. I heard you ran into him. News travels. Seoul's smaller than it thinks it is, and rich people talk." A pause. "How was it?" "Fine." "Nia." "It was fine, Ji-young. It was 90 seconds in a jewelry store." "He was buying a ring." "For his girlfriend." "Yes, I'm aware. I was standing there." "Are you okay?" Nia looked at her coffee. "Everyone keeps asking me that, because you're very good at saying you're fine when you're not, and the people who love you have developed a system for accounting for that." Nia was quiet for a moment. Then, "He texted me." The silence on Ji-young's end had a quality to it. "When?" "Thursday morning. The day after." "What did he say?" Nia told her. All 8 words, then the exchange. Ji-young listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when she was actually thinking, rather than just waiting for her turn. "He said he was tired of carrying the wrong version of the story," Ji-young repeated. "Yes." "And you said you'd be in touch." "Yes." "Have you?" "No." Another silence. Then Ji Young said carefully, "What does Malik know?" "That we texted. I told him Friday." "How did that go?" Naya pressed her thumbnail into the edge of the table. "He said he appreciated me telling him. He said he trusted me. He made dinner." "He made dinner? He's a good man." "He is. He's also not the man you're thinking about right now." "Ji Young, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not even telling you what I think. I'm just—" She stopped. "Look, you spent 3 years trying to get inside a man who wouldn't let you in, and it broke something in you that took you a long time to put back together. I watched that. I was there for it." "I know. So I need you to be honest with yourself about what you're walking toward. Not for his sake, and not for Malik's. For yours." Nia didn't answer for a long time. "He said he was tired of carrying the wrong version," she said finally. That's the first thing he's ever said to me that sounded like he actually looked at what happened. Or it's what a man says when he sees something he lost and wants it back. Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," Ji Young said. "They're not. That's the problem." She texted him Sunday afternoon. "I'm free Wednesday evening. There's a place near Hannam Bridge. Quiet. I'll send the address." His response came in under a minute. "I'll be there." She put her phone down and picked it up again and put it down, and then called Malik because she owed him that. Not a confession, not a drama, but honesty in the plain, undramatic way that she'd failed to practice consistently in her last marriage and had promised herself she wouldn't fail at again. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said. He sounded easy. He always sounded easy. "I'm meeting Do-hyun on Wednesday," she said, "for coffee, to talk. I wanted you to know." A pause. Not long. Not the pause of a man spiraling. The pause of a man being precise. "Okay," he said. "That's all you've got?" "What would you like me to say, Nia?" She pressed her hand flat on the table. "I don't know. Something. Anything that sounds like you have an opinion." "I have an opinion," Malik said. "I just don't think it's going to be useful to either of us right now." "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you've been somewhere else since Thursday. I think that somewhere else has a specific address. And I think you need to go find out what's there, because whatever's been in this relationship for the past 5 months, it's been missing something, and I've been pretending I didn't notice." The honesty of it hit her harder than an argument would have. "Malik's, I'm not angry," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry at you. I'm not angry at him." A pause. "I'm just not interested in being the plan someone settles for while they figure out the plan they actually want." She felt something tighten in her throat. "That's not what you are." "Maybe not yet," he said. "Go on Wednesday. Talk to him. Be honest. With him, and with yourself, and with me." He paused again. "I'll be here." She almost said, "Don't wait." She didn't say it. She wasn't honest enough yet for that. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Wednesday came with the particular cold of a Seoul evening in the turn of the season, the kind of cold that arrived at dusk and stayed personal, not brutal, not dramatic, just present against your face and hands as a steady reminder that warmth was a thing you had to choose. The cafe she'd chosen was small, independent, run by a woman in her 60s who'd stopped asking customers what they wanted after the first visit and simply brought them what they needed. Nia had found it a year ago during a long walk she'd taken after a bad week, and she'd been coming back ever since, usually alone, usually to sit near the window that looked toward the Han River's far bank, where the lights made long columns in the water. She arrived 8 minutes early and ordered before he got there because she needed something to do with her hands. He walked in at exactly the time they'd agreed on. Not early. He was never early. Not because he was careless about time, but because arriving early to things meant revealing that you cared about them. And revealing that he cared about things was a mechanism he'd spent 41 years disabling. She watched him scan the room and find her with the same efficiency he applied to everything. Assessing, locating, moving. He wore a dark coat over a gray sweater and looked like a man who had not slept particularly well in several days, which was the closest thing to vulnerability she'd ever seen on him in public. He sat down across from her. The cafe owner appeared, looked at him once, and brought him coffee he hadn't asked for. He looked mildly startled. Nia almost smiled. She does that, Nia said. Does she get it right? Always. He wrapped both hands around the cup. She noticed his hands. She'd always noticed his hands, which was an observation she filed away without examining. You look tired, she said. You look good, he said. A beat. He'd apparently decided to skip the preamble. I didn't rehearse this, she said. Good. Neither did I. He looked at her directly. I spent about 6 hours trying to figure out how to start this conversation, and everything I came up with sounded like a prepared statement. What stopped you? You would have seen through it in about 30 seconds. Probably 20. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. Then it was gone. I'm going to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. She picked up her cup. Go. I was not a good husband to you, he said. Not in the ways that mattered. I provided everything I thought a man was supposed to provide, and I withheld everything you actually needed, and I told myself that was protection. I know now that it wasn't. He paused. It was control. I kept you outside the things I was ashamed of because letting you see them meant risking that you'd leave, and the irony of that is not lost on me. She didn't say anything. She'd promised she wouldn't. You asked me once, he continued, his voice flat and even in the way it got when he was being most honest, stripped of all performance. You asked me once what I was actually afraid of. Not the rivals, not the investigations, not the professional threats. What I was afraid of personally. She remembered that conversation. 3 a.m, their second year, after a fight that had burned out into that particular silence that felt like the end of something. She'd asked him with all her exhaustion laid bare. He'd said, nothing. I lied, he said now. What I was afraid of was exactly what happened anyway, losing you. She set her cup down. Do-hyun, I know, he said. I know it's 2 years too late for this to be useful. I know you've built a life. I know there's someone else. He looked at the window for a moment, at the lights over the river. I'm not here to ask you for anything. I just needed you to have the accurate version of the story, because you went 2 years believing you weren't enough to make me open up, and that's not what happened. She looked at him for a long time. Something was happening in her chest that she didn't have immediate language for. Not hope, not anger, not grief exactly, but some compound thing with elements of all three. You're right, she said finally. It is too late for that to be useful. I know, and you're wrong that I thought it was about being enough. She picked up her cup again, holding it in both hands like ballast. I knew I was enough. I was angry, Do-hyun, not hurt in the way of someone who thinks they're lacking, hurt in the way of someone who kept reaching for a door that was always locked and eventually had to accept that the person on the other side had made a decision. He looked at her. I didn't know how to stay, she said. That's on me. I know how to push for a while, and I know how to leave. I never learned how to sit in front of a locked door long enough to outlast the person holding it closed. She paused. That's not entirely your fault. He exhaled. It was a small sound, nearly nothing, but she'd spent 3 years learning his frequency, and she recognized it. That specific release that meant something had been held a long time and was being put down. Are you happy? He asked. The question came out blunt, the way his questions always did. No softening, no approach, just the thing itself. She considered it honestly. I'm building something that looks like it, she said. I'm not sure that's the same as the real thing, but She stopped. I'm not unhappy. I wake up in my own life, which I built, which is mine. That matters. And the architect. His name is Malik. I know his name. Then use it. A beat. And Malik. She looked at him steadily. He's a good man. He's present in a way that you never managed to be. Do-hyun absorbed that without flinching. I know. Don't do that, she said sharply. Do what? Sit there and take it like a punishment, like you're absorbing it to prove something. If you have something to say it. His jaw tightened. There it was. The real one. Not the controlled performance, but the actual man behind it, who had a temper he kept on a short leash and opinions he kept behind iron doors. What would you like me to say? That it bothers me that someone else is giving you what I couldn't? Yes, it bothers me. Is that supposed to improve the situation? It's supposed to be honest. it is honest. Then say it like that instead of performing tolerance. He looked at her. She looked back. The cafe around them was quiet. Other people in their own small dramas, the city doing its city thing outside the glass. It bothers me, he said again, and this time there was nothing performed about it, just the flat, unguarded sound of it. Seeing him with his hand on your back in that boutique bothered me more than anything that's happened to me professionally in 2 years, and that is, categorically, objectively, not something I have any right to feel. No, she said. You don't. I know. But you feel it anyway. Yes, she breathed. So do I, she said. About her. The coat. The way she already knew how to stand next to you. She set the cup down precisely. I don't have any right to feel that either. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a tram moved along the far bank of the river, its lights dragging across the surface of the water and disappearing. I ended it with so Do-hyun said. Nia went still. She ended it, he corrected immediately, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. She looked at me the morning after the boutique and told me she deserved all of a person's heart, and she wasn't going to compete for a portion of mine. He paused. She was right. She sounds like someone with her priorities in excellent order. Yes. Nia looked at her hands, then at the window, then back at him. Do-hyun, I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not in a position right now to promise you anything. I'm in the middle of something with Malik that I owe him enough honesty to actually finish before I start anything else. And I'm... Another stop. I don't know if I trust this. You. The timing. I don't know if this is genuine reckoning or if this is just you seeing something you want and deciding to reach for it. That's fair, he said. Those aren't the same thing. I know they're not. So tell me which one this is. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to retreat behind the wall again. That old, specific silence that used to make her want to put her fist through something. But then he said, I don't entirely know. And that's the honest answer. I know I've been carrying something I haven't been willing to name for 2 years, and that seeing you opened it back up. I know that Seo-ah deserved better than what I was giving her, and that I stayed in it longer than I should have because I was trying to prove something to myself. And I know that what I said in that text is true. I'm tired of the wrong version of the story. He looked at her. Whether that's reckoning or wanting you back or both. I don't have enough clarity yet to give you a cleaner answer. She sat with that. Okay, she said. Okay. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 6 years, she said, including 3 years of marriage. His face did the thing again. That almost movement, the ghost of something, gone before it fully arrived. I know, he said. She stood up, put on her coat. He stood too, automatic, the gesture so ingrained she didn't think he was even aware of it. Standing when she stood, the physical habit of 3 years outlasting the marriage itself. She looked at him across the small table with the empty cups between them and felt the full, impossible, specific weight of it. The rain and the flower shop and 6 years of a story she hadn't finished writing and a man who had just for the first time told the truth with nothing held back. I need to talk to Malik, she said. I know. Don't text me until I do. Understood. She picked up her bag, started to turn. Nia. She stopped. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. No additional architecture around it, for all of it, but specifically for the Tuesday you left, and I let you go without saying that. She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to him for 2 full seconds, feeling those words in her chest, the specific shape of an apology she had needed for 2 years and had told herself she'd stopped needing. Then she walked out. She called Malik from the street. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he'd been awake and not looking at his phone, which was precisely the kind of considered behavior that made her feel standing on a cold soul pavement with the Han River 4 blocks away, like the worst version of herself. I need to see you, she said. Now? Tonight, if you can. A pause. You sound like someone who's already made a decision. She closed her eyes. I don't want to do this on the phone. Okay? His voice was steady. She hated how steady it was. Come over. The drive took 20 minutes. She spent it arguing with herself. Not about what she was going to say, because she knew what she was going to say, but about whether it was true that she was doing this for clean reasons or whether she was simply clearing ground. There was a difference between leaving something because it wasn't right and leaving it because something else was pulling. She hadn't figured out which one this was. Malik opened the door before she knocked. He was in sweats, which was a version of him she found almost unbearable to look at right now. This unguarded, domestic, available version of a man she had genuine affection for and was about to cause real pain. She sat on his couch. He sat across from her, not next to her, and she understood that he already knew, not the specifics, but the shape. I can't do this anymore, she said. I can't be here the way you deserve and also be… She stopped. I'm not leaving you for him. I want to be clear about that. I don't know what's happening with him, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But, Malik said, but something happened in that boutique that I've been carrying ever since, and I haven't been able to put it down. And you've been too good to me for me to keep carrying it quietly. She looked at him. You deserve someone whole. I'm not whole right now. Malik looked at her for a long time. Not with anger, with that clear, precise attention of his that saw things accurately and reported what it found. I know, he said. I'm sorry. Don't. He said it gently. You've been honest with me the whole way through. That's more than most people manage. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at his hands. I knew when I walked into that boutique and saw your face. I've known for a few weeks, honestly, if I'm being fair about it. She felt something crack open in her chest. Malik, it's all right, Nia. He looked up. I mean that. It's not all right in the sense that it doesn't hurt. It does. But it's all right in the sense that I'm not angry and I don't think you're a bad person and I hope whatever you're walking toward… He paused. I hope it gives you what it's supposed to. She wanted to tell him he deserved better than this. She did. She did say it, and he received it the way he received everything, without drama, with that composure that she had always appreciated and now, in this specific terrible moment, needed him not to have. Go on, he said. Whatever you need to figure out, go figure it out. She left his apartment at 9:47 and stood on the pavement outside and felt simultaneously like the most selfish version of herself and the most honest, which were not the same feeling and did not resolve neatly into each other. She took out her phone. She looked at Do Hyun's last text. I'll be there. She put the phone back in her pocket without responding and walked to her car and sat in it in the cold for a long time, engine off, watching the street in the way of someone who has just made a decision that closes several doors at once and doesn't know yet which ones. She sat in the car for 40 minutes, not thinking exactly, more like existing inside the specific aftermath of a decision, the way a room feels after a window has been broken, all changed air and changed light, and the knowledge that the shape of things has shifted in a way that can't be quietly reversed. The street outside Malik's building was ordinary in the way streets were ordinary at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday. A few people moving through the cold, a convenience store lit up across the way, a dog pulling its owner towards something interesting on the pavement. She watched it without seeing it. Then she started the car and drove home and went to bed without texting anyone. Thursday passed, the way Thursdays passed when a person was running from their own interior. In the relentless motion of work, back to back, the Lotte lobby and a new client consultation in Mapo and a sourcing call with the craftsman in Busan that finally connected after 3 weeks of missed timing. She was present in all of it, professional, focused. She gave every room her actual attention and left nothing on the table. She did not text Do-hyun. Friday morning, she woke at 5:30 with the specific alertness of someone whose subconscious had been running calculations all night and had arrived at a result. She made coffee and stood at her kitchen window and watched the city assemble itself in the gray pre-dawn and thought about what she actually wanted. Not what she owed anyone, not what was fair, not what the cautious version of herself would recommend. What she wanted. The answer was not simple. The answer was also not unclear. She picked up her phone. I talked to Malik, she wrote. We're not together anymore. I want you to know that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with what was already missing. I'm not telling you this to start something. I'm telling you because you were honest with me on Wednesday, and you deserve honesty back. She read it twice, sent it. His response came 40 minutes later when she was in the shower, and she read it dripping on the bathroom tile. I understand. Thank you for telling me. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'm not going anywhere. She put the phone face down on the sink and stood there in the cold and thought, this is either the beginning of something or the most expensive mistake I will ever make. Then she dried off and got dressed and went to work because the latte lobby wasn't going to specify itself. 3 weeks passed. They were careful, deliberate weeks, the kind that required active construction rather than passive living. She and Do-hyun texted intermittently, not urgently, not with the breathless frequency of people falling recklessly toward each other, but with the measured quality of two people who had been burned by their own worst impulses before and were choosing, this time, to move like people who understood what was at stake. He told her things he hadn't told her during the marriage. Small things, at first. The detail of a business negotiation that had gone sideways, a conversation with his younger brother that had left him more shaken than he'd expected. The kind of information that required no particular courage to share, but that he had, historically, kept behind his wall simply because opening any door at all had felt dangerous to him. She received each one without making it a larger occasion than it was. She didn't reward him for honesty the way you reward a child for good behavior. She just responded in kind, her own details, her own small truths, the accumulated texture of a life he hadn't been present for. It was, she thought, what their marriage should have been, what it might have been if either of them had known how. The thing about building something slowly was that it was also, technically, the thing that made you vulnerable to what you didn't see coming. She was in her studio on a Tuesday morning, 3.5 weeks after the cafe, when Ji-young called. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was in the middle of a detailed drawing and she hated being interrupted mid-precision. But something in the timing, Ji-young didn't call at 9 in the morning on a workday unless it was necessary, made her pick up. You need to come see me, Ji-young said. I'm working. Nia. A pause. The specific quality of it, controlled, careful, the voice of someone who had decided to say a thing they had been sitting on. Come see me. Today. Dick. Ji-young's gallery was closed on Tuesdays. She opened the side door before Nia knocked, which meant she'd been watching for her. Inside, the gallery was lit only by the installation lights over a small sculpture exhibition running through the month, low, directional, leaving most of the room in considered shadow. Ji-young looked like she hadn't slept. Not dramatically, she was too composed for dramatic deterioration, but there were specific signs that Nia had learned over years. The set of her jaw, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands even though it was obviously empty. Tell me, Nia said. Ji-young set the cup down. I need you to not react until I finish. That's not a reassuring opening. I know, sit down. Nia sat. She was already cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ji-young sat across from her and said, I had a conversation at a private dinner last Thursday with Baek Sung-jin. Nia knew the name. Everyone in Seoul's high-end property and development world knew Baek Sung-jin, a financier in his mid-50s. Old money, old connections, old allegiances that predated the current versions of several powerful families. He was talking, Ji-young continued, her voice precise, about the Kong Group's transition strategy, the legitimate side, the hotel acquisitions, and the private equity arm. Nia said nothing. He made it clear, not as a warning, not as a rumor, but as a statement of fact from a man who would know that Do-hyun's push into legitimate business is under serious pressure, not from competitors, from the family, from the old structure. What kind of pressure? Ji-young looked at her. The kind that doesn't show up in financial filings. Nia felt her breathing change. Say it directly. There's a faction inside the Kang organization, Sung-jin was careful not to name names, but he named enough, that believes Do-hyun's legitimization strategy is a threat to the existing power structure, that moving the money into clean businesses makes certain arrangements harder to maintain, and apparently, she stopped, picked up the empty cup, put it down. Apparently, there have been conversations about how to apply pressure to Do-hyun to slow that transition down. What kind of conversations? The kind that include identifying vulnerabilities, The word landed in the room and sat there. He's not vulnerable professionally, Ji Young said. His empire is too integrated at this point. His board positions, his legitimate holdings, they're not easy to attack directly. She paused. But he's been seen in the last 3 weeks meeting with an American designer in a cafe near Hannam Bridge, and with the same woman in what appears to be a reconciliation of some kind. And someone... She stopped again. Someone has been paying attention. Naya sat very still. Baek Sung-jin is not a good man, Ji Young said quietly. He was telling me because he's known my family for 30 years, and he was, in his way, being kind. But he was also making it clear that the people who want to pressure Do-hyun have identified the most efficient lever. Nia stood up. The floor felt different under her, not unstable, just altered, the way the physical world sometimes reconfigured itself slightly around a piece of information that changed the shape of things. "Does Do-hyun know?" she asked. "I don't know what Do-hyun knows." But Nia... Ji Young stood too, and she looked at Nia with the specific worry of a person who had been carrying this alone since Thursday and had exhausted their capacity to carry it further. If these people decide to use you as leverage, not physically, I don't think it's that kind of pressure, but publicly, financially, professionally, your business is in Seoul. Your clients are Korean corporations and Korean high net worth individuals. If someone with Baek Sung-jin's connections decided to quietly make you a problem for Do-hyun by making Do-hyun a liability for your professional reputation, I understand the mechanism, Nia said. I know you do. I just need you to hear it fully. Nia stood at the edge of one of Ji Young's installation lights, half in it, half not, and felt the specific weight of a situation she had not asked for and could not have predicted and now had to do something with. I have to tell him, she said. Yes. Today. Yes. She picked up her bag. At the door she stopped. Ji Young, this information from Baek Sung-jin, he won't repeat it. Not to anyone who would use it against you or Do-hyun. He's not that kind of player. She paused. But the people he was describing, they already know. That's what he was telling me. Nia walked out into the Tuesday morning and called Do-hyun. He answered on the second ring. I need to see you, she said. Not tonight, now. A pause. 1 second, 2. She heard him recalibrate, felt it almost through the phone. Where are you? Hannam-dong, Ji Young's gallery. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He arrived in 19. She was standing outside when his car pulled up, not because she'd been watching for him, but because she couldn't be still inside anymore. He got out without waiting for his driver and walked toward her and read her face in that way of his, the rapid total assessment, and said, Tell me. She told him. All of it, exactly as Ji Young had given it to her, without editorializing, without the softening she might have added if she'd had more time to think about how to deliver it. He stood on the pavement and listened with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing nothing at all, which was not the absence of reaction, but the deliberate active suppression of it. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. Baek Sung-jin said this, he said, to Ji Young, Thursday. He named the faction? No names, but she said he named enough. Do-hyun looked past her at something in the distance that wasn't there. She knew that look. He was processing, running the information through whatever internal architecture he used to assess threats, mapping it against what he already knew and finding the places where it fit. The places where it fit were clearly numerous because his expression, still controlled, still almost empty, was doing something around the edges that she'd seen before only a handful of times. Something that had no clean name but lived in the vicinity of a man confronting something he'd been half expecting and had hoped, with the private optimism of someone who doesn't admit to having private optimism, to avoid. You know who it is, she said. Not a question. He looked back at her. I have a strong hypothesis. Do-hyun, my uncle, he said. Kang Myung-soo, my father's younger brother. He said it the way he said things he'd already fully processed, flat, precise, all the emotion done privately before the words came out. He's run the old structure's logistics since before I was old enough to understand what the old structure was. When I began transitioning the organization, I brought him into the legitimate side as a courtesy, a position. A face-saving measure. He paused. I thought it would be enough. Apparently it wasn't. Apparently he views the transition not as evolution, but as an attempt to cut him out. Is he right? A beat. Eventually, yes. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in the directness of it. No deflection, no performance, just the clean, difficult truth of it that hit her somewhere specific. He's using me, she said. Your uncle, to pressure you. Not yet, but that's the architecture. What does that mean for... She stopped, started again. What does it mean for what's happening between us? He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him decide something, watched the decision move across his face in the particular way of a man choosing between the careful answer and the true one. It means, he said, that I have to handle this before it becomes a weapon aimed at you. And handling it means confronting something I've been managing at a distance for 2 years. He paused. My uncle is not a man who responds to careful management forever. At some point, he needs to be faced directly. And if you do that, it will be ugly, he said. It will be internal, and it will be messy, and it will involve the kind of conversation I have never allowed myself to have with him, because having it meant admitting that the old structure is not something I can simply transition away from. I have to dismantle parts of it, actively, and my uncle will fight that. Do-hyun. She took a breath. Is this dangerous? Physically? He held her gaze. Not to you. That's not what I asked. His jaw moved. My uncle is not suicidal. He won't move against me directly. What he'll do is precisely what Baek Sung-jin described. He'll make noise, create pressure, find leverage. It's his methodology. He paused. But if I move against him first, and clearly, and in a way that makes the outcome of a conflict obvious, he'll stand down. And if he doesn't? He didn't answer immediately. If he doesn't, she said again, then we have a different kind of problem, he said quietly. But I don't believe it will come to that. She looked at the pavement, at the gallery door, at the sky, which was the particular flat gray of a Seoul morning that couldn't decide whether to rain or simply stay sullen. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I'm not afraid, she said. I want to be clear about that. What Ji-young told me, it didn't make me want to run. It made me angry. She looked at him directly. Someone is sitting in a room somewhere in this city, deciding that I'm a tool to be used against you, that my work, my reputation, the thing I built here from nothing, is leverage. And that makes me... She stopped, breathed. I need you to understand that I'm not going to be managed. Not by your uncle, not by anyone inside your world, and not by you. If we're doing this, we're doing it as equals, which means I need to know things, Do-hyun. The real things, not the curated things, all of it. He looked at her. All of it, she said again. The weight of that landed between them with complete clarity. Not dramatic, not the kind of movie moment that swells and announces itself, but the quiet, total weight of a demand that had been years in the making, standing in ordinary gray daylight on a pavement in Hanam-dong. He said, that's going to require me to tell you things I've never told anyone. I know. Some of it is... He stopped. Started. It's not what most people would accept. I'm not most people, she said, and I'm not the person you married, who let you stay silent because she didn't know how to outlast you. I know how to outlast you now. I did it for 2 years. Something moved across his face. Not the ghost of a smile this time. Something more substantial, something that looked, briefly and completely, like the actual man. I know you did, he said. So, all of it. He exhaled, one long, controlled breath out, the kind that acknowledged something had just changed. I'll tell you everything, he said, but I need to handle my uncle first, before he moves, before he has the chance to make you the target. He held her gaze. Give me 72 hours. She considered him, the set of his shoulders, the absence of the wall, not gone, but down in a way she'd never seen outside a 3 a.m. fight at the end of their worst year. 72 hours, she said. Then you tell me everything. Everything, he said. She nodded once. He turned to go back to his car, and she said his name, and he stopped. If this goes wrong, she said, if your uncle decides to come after my work, my clients, my reputation in this city, it won't. But if it does? He turned back and looked at her and said, with a flatness that was not coldness but its opposite, the specific sound of absolute conviction with nowhere to hide. I will burn every bridge I have in this city before I let anything he does touch what you've built here. That's not a romantic statement. That's a fact. She held his gaze for a moment. Go handle your uncle, she said. He went. The 72 hours passed in a specific kind of slow. She worked. She answered emails. She made decisions about tile specifications and lighting temperatures and the sourcing of a particular reclaimed wood she'd been tracking for 8 months. She called her mother in Atlanta on Thursday evening and talked for an hour about everything except the thing occupying the center of her mind, and her mother, who had met Do-hyun twice and said, both times, exactly nothing, which from her mother was itself a verdict, asked carefully how she was doing. Working, Nia said. Her mother said, which was also a verdict. 72 hours after the pavement in Hanam-dong, Do-hyun hadn't called. She sat with that through Friday evening, told herself it was fine, that confrontations with entrenched family power structures didn't run on neat schedules, that he was a man who was methodical and careful and didn't communicate until he had something to communicate. By Saturday morning, she was not sitting with it well. She was in her studio at 8, ostensibly reviewing project files, actually watching her phone with the focused attention of a woman trying to appear not to be watching her phone, when it finally rang. Not Do-hyun's number, an unknown number. Sole prefix. She answered, Ms. Brooks. The voice was male, older, unhurried in the way of a man who had spent a lifetime not needing to hurry. Speaking in English, which was itself a statement, he had done his research. I think it's time we spoke directly. My name is Kang Myung-soo. I believe you know who I am. She felt her entire body go still. I have a proposal for you, he said. Very simple, very clean. I believe that once you hear it, you'll agree that the most sensible path forward for everyone involved, including yourself and the excellent business you've spent 7 years building in this city, is to step back from my nephew. A pause. Permanently, and without drama. She said nothing. I have significant relationships, he continued, with 4 of the 6 corporate clients who currently represent the majority of your firm's annual revenue. I also have a long-standing friendship with the chairman of the development authority that issued the permits for your Mapo project. His voice remained pleasant throughout. I want to be clear that I have no interest in using these relationships destructively. That would be wasteful and unnecessarily unkind. But I do need you to understand the full context of the conversation you are deciding whether to have with me. The studio around her was very quiet. I understand the context, she said. Her voice came out level. She was mildly amazed by that. Good, he said. Then let me ask you something honestly, Ms. Brooks, woman to man. A slight pause, as though he found himself mildly amusing. Do you believe my nephew has changed, truly? Or do you believe you are in the early weeks of what will eventually become the same story you left 2 years ago, except this time with considerably higher stakes for everyone, including you? She said nothing. I ask, he continued, because I've known Do-hyun since he was born. I have watched him construct walls around himself that no one has ever fully breached. You came closer than most, I'll give you that. But the things he is carrying, Ms. Brooks, the decisions he has made, the things he has done and overseen and been responsible for over the past 15 years, and the management of this family's interests. He paused, and the pause was precisely calculated. Has he told you? The full accounting? Not the version he's preparing to give you. The actual history? Something was happening in her chest, a cold, specific dread that had nothing to do with fear for herself. You should ask him, Kang Myung-soo said gently, about the Incheon arrangement in 2019. Ask him specifically what decision he made and what the consequence of that decision was for the man who stood in his way. Another pause. And then decide whether the person you are reconsidering a future with is the person you believe him to be, or someone considerably more complicated. He ended the call. She stood in the middle of her studio, the space she'd built to reflect the way she thought about things. Honest materials, nothing false, nothing that pretended to be what it wasn't, and felt the ground beneath the last 3 weeks shift in a way that was quiet and total and completely without drama, which was somehow worse than any version that came with noise. She picked up her phone. She called Do Hyun. He answered in one ring. "Nia, your uncle just called me," she said. Silence. "He mentioned something called the Incheon arrangement," she said. 2019. The silence on his end had a quality she'd never heard before. Not the controlled silence, not the processing silence, something else entirely. Something that sounded, under all his engineering, like the silence on his end had a quality she'd never heard before. Not the controlled silence, not the processing silence. Something that lived underneath all of that, in the place where the engineering stopped and whatever was actually there began. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough that she checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Where are you?" he said. "My studio. Don't go anywhere." A pause. "I mean that, Nia. Stay where you are. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do-hyun." 20 minutes. He hung up. She stood with the dead phone in her hand and looked at the north-facing windows and the flat Saturday morning light coming through them and thought about Kang Myung-soo's voice. Pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man doing something completely routine, and thought about the specific phrasing he'd used. Ask him what decision he made and what the consequence of that decision was for the man who stood in his way. Not an accusation, a coordinate, precise and deliberate, dropped into the conversation like a key left on a counter. "Here, this door. Open it yourself." She set her phone on the work table and walked to the window and looked at the street below and felt the full weight of the last 3 weeks settle differently on her shoulders. Not heavier exactly, but differently distributed, like a load that had shifted and was now pressing on parts of her that hadn't been load-bearing before. He arrived in 18 minutes. She heard him on the stairs. His footsteps had a particular rhythm she had apparently retained in some archive of herself she hadn't known was still running. And then he was at the studio door, which she'd left unlocked, and he came in without knocking because she'd left it unlocked, and he knew what that meant. He looked like a man who had been awake since before she'd called him. His coat was on, but wrong. One collar slightly up, a button offset by one. The kind of detail that only registered if you knew what he looked like when he was immaculate, which she did. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing that thing, moving, assessing, too fast for the room they were in, calibrated for a different kind of danger than was currently present. She watched him look at her, watched him take in the fact that she was standing and not sitting, which told him something, and that her face was what it was, which told him more. "Sit down," she said. He sat. Not at the work table. On the low concrete bench along the studio wall, which put him below her eye line in a way that she didn't think was accidental. It was, she realized, a choice. He was making himself smaller. He was doing it deliberately. She stayed standing. "Tell me about Incheon," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a door he'd been dreading for a long time and found it already open. 2019, Webb, he said. "I was in the middle of the transition. The legitimate side was growing, but the old structure was still. It was still running. Certain operations, distribution arrangements that predated my father, that had roots deep enough that you couldn't just sever them without creating a collapse that would take down the clean businesses too." He paused. "There was a man named Park Hyun-tae. He ran the logistics for the Incheon port arrangements, had run them for 11 years. He was effective. He was loyal. And when I told him the arrangements were being wound down, that I was transitioning out of that entire category of operation, he decided that the way to respond was to take the documentation he'd accumulated over 11 years of working for us and use it." Use it how? He went to a competitor first, offered everything he had, financial records, personnel information, the full picture of how the port operation worked, in exchange for protection and a position. His voice was level, completely, deliberately level. The competitor declined. Too much exposure. He paused. Then he went to a journalist. Nia felt the cold in her chest deepen. "I found out before the journalist could verify anything." He kept his eyes on her face. No deflection now, no architecture, just the facts, laid out with the same precision he brought to everything, which was somehow worse than evasion. I had a choice. Let the documentation go public, which would have taken down not just the old operations, but the legitimate businesses I'd spent 6 years building, and everyone employed by them, and every transition I'd made toward something cleaner. Or, she said, or I handled it. How? Park Hyun-tae was offered a significant sum of money, relocation abroad, and a full severance from the organization. He paused. He declined. Then what? Then the documentation was recovered. He held her gaze. Park Hyun-tae was not harmed. I want to be clear about that. He was contained for a period of time. While the situation was resolved and while arrangements were made to ensure that his decision to go to the journalist didn't produce consequences that he, at that point, had not thought through for himself. He paused. He lives in Portugal now. He has been there since 2020. He is alive and he is not a prisoner. But he didn't choose Portugal, Nia said. A beat. No. You chose it for him. Yes. She turned away from him, walked 3 steps toward the window and stopped. She could feel him behind her, not moving, barely breathing, the specific stillness of a man who had learned that some outcomes required you to simply be present for them and not try to manage the shape they took. Was he the only one? She asked. The only one in that situation? Yes. People have been hurt in the history of this organization, Nia. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I arrived at this position with clean hands. I can't tell you that. His voice didn't waver. What I can tell you is what I have done since I had the power to make different choices, and what I intend to continue doing. She turned back around. Did you know, when you were with me, during the marriage? The Incheon situation happened in 2019. We were married. So yes. And you never told me. No. Because you were protecting me. His jaw tightened slightly. Because I was protecting myself, he said. From the possibility that you would leave. She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing hidden in his face right now. It was possibly the most exposed she had ever seen him. In 3 years of marriage and 3 weeks of rebuilding and all the years of memory in between, and it was not comfortable to look at because exposed and okay were not the same thing. Your uncle told me this to make me run, she said. I know. He thought that if I knew, I'd decide you weren't who I thought you were, and I'd walk away and he'd have removed the leverage without having to use it. That's correct. He underestimated me. Do-hyun said nothing. He was watching her with an attention so complete and so carefully restrained that she could see the restraint itself. The effort it was costing him to sit on that bench and not reach for her and not manage this and not do any of the 1,000 things his instincts were trained to do in difficult situations. I'm not running, she said, but I need you to hear something. Tell me. I'm not going to pretend that what you just told me is fine, she said. It's not fine. A man didn't choose his life, and you chose it for him, and that is a real thing that happened, and I'm not going to tidy it up for you or for me. She held his gaze. But I'm also not going to let your uncle decide what I do with information he delivered specifically to control me. I will decide that. She paused. And what I'm deciding is that I'm going to stay and deal with this. With all of it. But Do-hyun, if there is anything else I don't know, you tell me now. Not when it comes out. Not when someone else decides to use it against us. Now. He exhaled. Long, slow, the breath of someone releasing something they'd held in their body for a long time. My uncle, he said, has his own documentation, different from Hyun-tae's, broader. It covers operations going back 20 years, including decisions made by my father that I subsequently had legal responsibility for inheriting. He's had it for years as insurance, for himself, not to use against me, but in case the family ever needed leverage against external pressure. He paused. The threat he made to you about your clients and your permits, that's the soft version. The harder version is that if I move against him directly and he feels genuinely cornered, he will use what he has in a way that takes everything down. The legitimate business, the transition, all of it. He stopped. Possibly including me personally. The room was very quiet. Meaning prosecution, she said. Meaning prosecution. And you've known this was possible. I've known it was the endgame risk since I started the transition. I've been managing around it. moving assets, restructuring, insulating the clean businesses from the historical documentation as much as legally possible. He looked at her steadily. I thought I had more time. My uncle moving now, earlier than I expected, means either he knows how close I am to making the insulation complete, or he's more frightened than I assessed. Which is it? Both, probably. She walked to the work table and sat down across from him, the length of the studio between them closing to a few feet of cold air. She looked at the man who had just handed her the complete, unedited, indefensible truth of himself across a concrete floor in a studio she'd built to contain only honest things. And she felt in her chest the specific, complicated, completely inconvenient thing she'd been trying not to name for 3 weeks. What do you need? She said. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't know. To handle your uncle, she said. What do you need? Nia, I'm not asking you to tell me it's under control. I'm asking what you actually need. He was quiet for a moment, then, I need a meeting with him, in person, before he makes another move. He paused. And I need him to understand that his leverage, his documentation, has an expiration. That I have built the legitimate side to the point where even a prosecution, even the worst outcome, doesn't take down what I've constructed. That his insurance policy is worth less than he believes. Is that true? A beat. Not entirely, not yet. But if he believes it's true, he stands down. Or he pauses long enough for me to make it true. She looked at him. He looked back. Call him, she said. What? Call your uncle. Right now, from here. She held Do-hyun's gaze. Tell him you want to meet. Today. Something moved across his face. The rapid, private calculation of a man running an assessment at speed. He called you to destabilize us before I could handle this on my terms, Do-hyun said slowly. If I call him now, it signals that you told me immediately and that his move didn't work, she said. Yes, that's exactly what it signals. He tried to use me and it didn't land the way he planned, and now you're calling on your schedule, not his. She paused. Don't let him control the timing, Do-hyun. He stared at her. Then he took out his phone. Kang Myung-soo answered on the 4th ring. His voice carried the same measured pleasantness it had with Nia an hour earlier. A man in his element, running a situation he'd designed. Nephew, he said. The word landed with a weight that made Nia's skin tighten from 3 feet away. Today, Do-hyun said. His voice was the flattest she'd ever heard it. Not cold, not controlled, simply stripped of everything except the message. The Seongbuk House. 4 o'clock. A pause. My, Myung-soo said softly. She told you quickly. 4 o'clock, Do-hyun said. Come alone. He hung up. He held the phone for a moment. Then he set it down on the concrete bench beside him and looked at his hands. Looked at them with the specific attention of a man taking inventory of what he had available. He'll come, Nia said. He'll come. Will you be safe? He looked up. Yes. He doesn't want a war. He wants a return to the previous arrangement. He thinks he can frighten me back into it. Can he? The answer was immediate. No. She nodded. Looked at the window. Looked back. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. Do-hyun, no? The flatness was gone. There was something underneath it now, something with actual heat in it. This is not a conversation you need to be inside of. What my uncle will say, what the full picture of this family looks like when it's laid out in a room, you don't need that in your body. You don't need to carry it. That's you protecting me again, she said. This time, it's actually protection, he said. Not control, not fear. I know the difference now. He held her gaze. I'm asking you, as a person who is choosing to do this differently, stay here. Let me handle this part. I'll come back and I will tell you everything that happens in that room. Every word. Nothing withheld. She looked at him for a long moment. Everything, she said. Everything. And if it goes wrong, it won't. Do-hyun. Her voice had an edge to it. If it goes wrong, he said, there is a file with Park Jae-won, my assistant. It contains a full accounting of the legitimate business structure, its legal insulation, and specific instructions for 3 lawyers who know what to do with it. He paused. You are named in those instructions as a person to be contacted, not as a liability, as someone to be protected. She absorbed that. You set that up before today, she said. I set it up 2 weeks ago, when we were still just texting. Yes. She felt something move through her chest, not warmth exactly, not yet, but its precursor. The particular quality of learning that someone had been considering your safety in the quiet, without announcing it, without making it a performance. Go, she said. He stood, picked up his phone, walked toward the door, and stopped. Nia, don't, she said. Don't say anything significant right now. Come back first. Say it after. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he walked out. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, that rhythm she'd carried in her archive without meaning to, and then the door below, and then nothing. She sat in the studio alone and looked at the north-facing light, and waited. Up. The Seongbuk house was a property Do-hyun had inherited from his father, not the primary family compound, which had been sold and redeveloped, but a secondary residence on a hillside with a walled garden and rooms that had absorbed decades of conversations that never made it into any official record. He'd kept it for reasons he'd never examined too closely, probably for exactly this. He arrived at 3:40. His driver waited at the gate. Chaewon was at the office with instructions. The house was empty except for a caretaker who had been given the afternoon. He stood in the main room and looked at the furniture his father had chosen and breathed the specific air of a place that was full of a past he'd been trying to move away from, and he let himself feel the weight of it for exactly as long as it took to take 3 breaths. Then he put it down. Myung-soo arrived at 4:02. He came in with the ease of a man arriving at a home he considered partially his, which, in his understanding of the family structure, it was. He wore a dark suit and no visible tension anywhere on his body, and his eyes when they found Do-hyun across the room were the eyes of a man conducting a meeting he believed he'd already won. You look tired, Myung-soo said. Sit down, Do-hyun said. Myung-soo sat. He looked around the room with a proprietorial attention. I used to come here with your father, he said. After difficult weeks, we'd sit in this room and he'd say, Stop, Do-hyun said. Myung-soo stopped, looked at him. You called her, Do-hyun said. You went outside the family. You contacted someone with no part in any of this, and you used her professional livelihood as a pressure tool. His voice was flat and precise and not loud, which was more effective than loud would have been, and they both knew it. I need to know if you understand what that was. I understand it was necessary, Myung-soo said mildly. It was a line, Do-hyun said. You crossed it. Lines. Myung-soo tilted his head slightly. Your father didn't speak much about lines. My father is dead, Do-hyun said. And the way he ran things died with him. That is not a sentiment. It is a structural reality. The organization he built cannot exist in its original form in the current environment. The regulatory framework, the international pressure, the digital trail that follows every financial transaction, the old model is not viable. I have been trying to explain this to you for 2 years. You've been trying to cut me out for 2 years, Myung-soo said. Not heated, observed. Frame it however you like. I gave you a position, I gave you access to the legitimate side, I gave you a waiting room, Myung-soo said sharply. The pleasantness cracked slightly, just at the edge. A comfortable waiting room while you built something that didn't need me in it. While you moved the money and the assets and the relationships into structures that your generation controls and that mine becomes slowly invisible in. He leaned forward slightly. I built things too, Do-hyun, for 30 years. Under your father, in conditions you have never had to operate in. And now you want to hand me a title and a desk and a glass tower and tell me it's a promotion. Ishpis. Yimman. Do-hyun looked at him. What do you want? I want what I'm owed. Name it. Myung-soo leaned back. The crack had closed. The pleasantness was back, more dangerous now for having slipped once. The Incheon operation is not fully wound down, he said. You believe it is. It isn't. There are arrangements I've maintained, independently, as a contingency. They are currently profitable, and they are currently clean enough that the documentation I hold represents leverage in both directions. He paused. I want those arrangements formally recognized. A structure that legitimizes the revenue and gives me independent standing, not a desk, not a title. A position in the organization that I cannot be removed from. What you're describing, Do-hyun said slowly, is a permanent anchor to the old structure. I'm describing security, Myung-soo said, for both of us. No. The word was immediate and complete. No arrangements, no legitimization of independent operations I didn't authorize, no permanent structure built around the leverage you think you have. Myung-soo's eyes sharpened. Think I have. Do-hyun reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table between them. Myung-soo looked at it without touching it. Open it, Do-hyun said. He opened it. He read the first page. He read the second. He turned to the third and stopped, and for the first time in the conversation, something entered his expression that had not been there before. Not panic, not quite, but the precursor to it, the specific look of a man whose assessment of the board has just been revised mid-game. This is a restructuring, he said. Complete as of 4 days ago, Do-hyun said. The legitimate holdings are now held through a structure that is legally independent of every historical operation. The insulation is complete. The documentation you hold, the 20-year accounting, can damage the historical record. It cannot reach the current structure. It cannot touch the hotels, the development arm, the equity positions. He paused. What it can do is damage me personally, possibly prosecute me personally. I've thought about that. I've made a decision about that. Myung-soo set the folder down very carefully. I'm prepared to accept that risk, Do-hyun said, because the alternative, maintaining any part of the old structure, allowing any anchor to remain, is not a risk I'm prepared to accept indefinitely. The legitimate business survives without me, if it comes to that. I've made sure of it. He held his uncle's gaze. Your leverage is not what you believed it was. And the woman you called this morning is not a variable in this equation anymore. I've removed her from the exposure. His voice had not risen once. So, we are at a point where you can use what you have and accept the consequences of that, which include a legal investigation that will also examine your independent arrangements in considerable detail. Or you can take the separation package my legal team has prepared, which is substantial, and which comes with an agreement that ends this. Myung-soo was still looking at the folder. His hands, Do-hyun noticed, were very still on his knees. The stillness of a man who is performing composure over something that had shifted underneath him. You've been planning this for longer than 2 years, Myung-soo said. Since the day my father died, Do-hyun said. Silence. The woman, Myung-soo said. The American. You restructured 4 days ago, before she knew any of this. Before today. Yes. You protected her before you knew she'd stay. Do-hyun said nothing. Myung-soo looked at him with an expression that was not warm and not cold, but was, underneath everything, something that might have been the remnant of a man who had once been a different kind of person, in a different kind of room, before 30 years of specific choices had made him who he currently was. She must be something, he said quietly. Take the package, Do-hyun said. Myung-soo looked at the folder for a long time. The room held its breath. 30 years of architecture, 20 years of documentation, the whole weight of a structure that had been built by 2 brothers and was now being asked to become something smaller and finally finished by one of their sons. He reached out and picked up the folder. He stood. I'll have my attorney contact yours, he said. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn. Your father would have... Don't, Do-hyun said. A pause. Myung-soo walked out. Do-hyun stood in the room his father had furnished and breathed the specific air of it and waited until he heard the car at the gate start and move and then fade into the hill road's distance. Then he sat down in the chair his father had favored and put his elbows on his knees and pressed his face into his hands and stayed there for 60 seconds, not thinking, not planning, not running any calculation at all, just existing in the aftermath of 30 years coming to a specific, quiet, anticlimactic end. Then he picked up his phone and called Nia. She answered before the first ring finished. Well, she said. It's done, he said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. The engineering was still down. He didn't put it back up. He's taking the package. A pause on her end. He could hear her breathing, hear the specific sound of relief moving through a person who has been holding something tightly for several hours. "Are you okay?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I will be," he said. "Come back," she said. He was already standing, already moving toward the door and the car and the city and the studio with the north-facing windows, and the woman who had stayed in it waiting for him, who had been handed the worst of him and had said, "What do you need?" instead of, he drove back through Seoul in the early evening dark. The city had fully committed to night by 5:30, the way it did in this season. Not gradually, not with the slow amber bleeding of a summer dusk, but decisively. Lights coming on all at once across the hillsides and the river corridor and the towers downtown like a decision being made at scale. He drove with his hands at the bottom of the wheel and his coat still on, and the heat in the car turned up higher than he usually kept it, because something in him was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Chaewon had texted twice. He didn't read them. His attorney had called once. He let it go. He drove and thought about his uncle's hands on his knees, the deliberate stillness of them, and about the folder, and about the chair his father had favored in the Seongbuk house, and about the specific quality of silence that fills a room when 30 years of something finally stop moving. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you'd carried long enough that the absence of it changed the way you moved, disorienting before it was freeing, the body not yet trusting that it was allowed to stand differently. He pulled up outside her building at 6:11. He sat in the car for 2 minutes, not planning anything, not preparing a version of himself for the conversation ahead, just sitting in the quiet with the engine off and letting the cold come in gradually, and thinking about what it meant to walk into a room with nothing held back. He'd told her he would tell her everything. He'd meant it. He hadn't fully understood until this moment what it would feel like to actually do it, to walk towards someone with no architecture between you and them. No carefully maintained distance, nothing managed or withheld or shaped for the least vulnerable presentation. It felt, sitting in the cold car in the dark, like standing on a ledge he'd spent his entire adult life building walls around so he'd never have to stand on. He got out of the car. She heard his steps on the stairs and was already standing when he came through the studio door. She'd been standing for the last 10 minutes without being aware of making the decision to stand, her body apparently having made its own arrangements about how to receive whatever was coming. He looked, not destroyed, not triumphant, wrung out in the specific way of someone who has been running a sustained calculation at high intensity for many hours, and has finally reached a result and is now simply in the aftermath of that. The engine still running, but with nothing left to drive. He closed the door behind him. "Tell me," she said. Same word she'd used at the gallery with Ji Young, same word she'd used in the studio that morning. She was apparently a person who moved toward things directly now. When that had happened, exactly, she couldn't say. He told her. All of it. Not the version he might have given 2 years ago, strategic, selective, shaped to produce a specific impression. The actual account. Myung-soo arriving with his pleasant voice and his 30 years of grievance. The folder on the table. The restructuring that Do-hyun had completed 4 days ago before she'd known any of it was coming, before she'd had any say in whether she wanted to be protected. The moment his uncle had picked up the folder and stood and said, "I'll have my attorney contact yours," with the specific quality of a man who had just recalculated his position and found it untenable. He stood in the middle of her studio and talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and she listened without interrupting, and the north-facing windows behind her held the dark of the city outside, and the studio's honest materials, the concrete, the reclaimed wood, the steel, absorbed it all without comment, the way honest spaces do. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You restructured 4 days ago," she said. "Yes. When we'd been talking for 3 weeks and nothing was certain." "Yes." "You protected me before you knew if there was anything to protect." He looked at her. "Yes." She sat down on the edge of the work table and put her hands flat on the surface behind her. She was looking at him with the expression he'd been trying to read correctly for 6 years, the one that meant she was not deciding what to feel, but rather being honest about what she already felt, and taking the time to be sure of it before she gave it to anyone. "I need to say something," she said, And I need you to hear it without defending yourself or explaining yourself or doing any of the things you do when something lands too close. Okay. What you did in 2019, see, the Incheon situation, that is not something I can tell you is right. I'm not going to do that. She held his gaze steadily. A man's life was redirected without his consent. I understand the context. I understand the stakes you were managing. I understand that the alternative had consequences for a lot of people who hadn't done anything. I understand all of that, and it doesn't change what it was. She paused. What it was a hard choice made by someone with power over someone without it. And those choices have weight. They don't disappear because the reasoning was solid. He said nothing. He was listening. Actually listening, she could tell. Not waiting for his turn, not preparing a response. Just receiving what she was giving him with the fullness of a man who had decided to stop filtering incoming truth. I'm not leaving because of it, she said. That's not what this is. But I needed you to hear that I see it. The whole thing. Not just the version where you were protecting the transition and the people employed by the legitimate side and doing the pragmatic calculus of impossible situations. She paused. The version where a man is in Portugal because you put him there. I know, he said, quiet, absolute. I know. Do you think about him? A pause. Long enough to tell her the answer before he gave it. Yes, he said. Not constantly, but consistently. Every time the Incheon operation comes up in any context. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. I put money in an account for him. Annually. He doesn't know where it comes from. I don't know if he accepts it. A pause. It doesn't fix it. I know it doesn't fix it. She looked at him for a long time. No, she said. It doesn't, but it's something. She breathed. It's the something that tells me you know the difference between what had to be done and what was right. And that's the part I can work with. He exhaled. She heard the whole weight of the day in it. Come here, she said. He crossed the studio floor and she didn't get up from the work table edge, which put him standing in front of her with their heights nearly even and 3 inches of air between them. And she looked at him up close, really looked, the way she'd looked at him in the boutique 3 weeks ago with all the pretense stripped away. And she reached up and fixed his coat collar, the one that had been wrong since he arrived. She straightened it with both hands, slow and deliberate, her fingers against the fabric of his collar, and he went completely still under her hands, the way a person goes still when something they'd stopped expecting simply happens. You had one button wrong too, she said. I know, he said. I noticed in the car. And you left it. I had other things on my mind. She fixed the button, smoothed the lapel, kept her hands there for a moment against his chest, feeling the particular living warmth of him under the coat and the wool, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been trying to name for 3 weeks arrive. Finally, at its actual name without apology or qualification. I never stopped, she said. I want you to know that. I left because I had to, not because I stopped. His hands came up and covered hers against his chest, not gripping, just there, present. The simple physical fact of it. I know, he said. His voice had come entirely undone from whatever kept it flat and controlled, just his actual voice. I knew when you were still there. I didn't know what to do with it. And now? Now, he said, I'm standing in your studio at 6 in the evening, having just told you everything I've spent 15 years not telling anyone, with my collar fixed and my hands over yours, and I have no next move prepared. A pause. That's new for me. She almost smiled. How does it feel? He thought about it honestly, which was still new enough to be visible on his face when he did it. Terrifying, he said. And he stopped. And like the first thing in a long time that's actually real, he said. She leaned her forehead against his chest, just below her own hands, and he put his arms around her very carefully, the way you hold something you have broken once and understand the specific weight and fragility of. And they stood in the honest space she'd built and let the evening settle around them without trying to shape it into anything other than what it was. The months that followed were not easy. She would say that later when people, Ji Young, her mother, a journalist who wrote a piece about her firm's expansion and asked casually about her personal life, asked how it had gone. She would say, it wasn't easy. And she would mean it because the version of their story that rebuilt itself over those months was built on actual ground, which meant it had to account for actual weight. He told her, in stages, over evenings in her studio and mornings in his apartment, and one long weekend in November when they drove to the coast and rented a house and didn't talk to anyone else for 3 days. The full accounting. Not all at once, not in a single confession that could be received and filed and moved past, but incrementally, the way you tell the truth when you've spent a long time not telling it and have to build the muscle for it. The history of the organization. The decisions he'd been responsible for. The specific geometry of how a man inherits something he didn't choose and makes choices within it that he has to carry. She listened every time without turning it into the version she preferred, without smoothing the edges or finding the reading that made him easiest to love. She let it be what it was. There were nights she went home to her own apartment and sat with it in the way of someone processing something that didn't resolve into clean positions. He was not a simple man who had done simple things. The life he'd been built for had left marks, and some of those marks were on other people, and there was no narrative she could construct that erased that. What she could do, what she chose to do, actively and with full awareness of the choice, was see the whole person. The man who had stood in the rain so a stranger could stay dry. The man who had loved her and locked her out of that love from fear. The man who had spent 15 years building an exit from something he'd been born into, slowly, at significant personal risk, because he decided that the direction of his choices could diverge from the direction of his inheritance. The man who had restructured his entire financial architecture to protect her before he knew if she was staying. She chose him. Not the simplified version, not the version that required her to ignore what she knew, the whole version, weight and all, because that was the only version that was real. He changed in ways that were not dramatic and therefore were. He told her about his days, not reports, actual accounts, the texture of things, what a meeting had felt like, when a negotiation had frustrated him, when his younger brother had said something during a phone call that had stayed with him. He offered these things without being asked, which cost him something she could see it costing, and she received them the way they were given, as significant, without making the significance a production. He started leaving his phone face up. This was a small thing that was not a small thing. For years, he'd had the habit of placing his phone face down on any surface. Automatic, total. The physical posture of a man whose entire relationship with communication was structured around control of information. Face up meant readable, meant visible, meant someone could see who was calling or what was arriving. He started doing it in her presence first, then generally, and she noticed and said nothing about it because acknowledging it would make it a performance, and it wasn't a performance. It was just a man slowly disassembling a habit he'd built from fear. She brought a plant to his apartment, not the same species as the herbs she'd left the first time. Something more architectural, a large-leafed variety that didn't need much but needed something consistent. He watered it without being reminded. It didn't die. She didn't mention this to him either. She just noticed. His advisors objected to her presence at a development meeting in January, but not aggressively, professionally, the politely framed concern of men who had managed Do Hyun's image and his separations for years and were uncomfortable with the variable of a person who hadn't signed the right documents. He listened to their concern and then introduced her at the meeting as his partner, by which he meant both things, and did not revisit the question. His family, the parts of it that remained functional after Myung-soo's departure from the organization, which had been processed through attorneys and documents, and one very quiet meeting at the Seongbuk house that Do Hyun had attended alone and told her about afterward in full. Were cautious with her in the way families are cautious with the returned presence of someone they'd previously had to develop opinions about. His younger brother, Sung-jun, called her Nuna on the third meeting, which was either a peace offering or a test, and she'd responded in kind and watched him relax by about 30%. There was no ceremony to this, no single moment when the family's posture toward her resolved into acceptance. It happened the way most things happened when they happened genuinely, gradually through the accumulation of ordinary occasions in which she was simply present and consistently herself, until being present and consistently herself became unremarkable and therefore real. Myung-soo's attorney finalized the separation package in February. Do Hyun signed the documents in his office with Chae-won as witness, and sent them through and spent the rest of that afternoon on the Busan development, which had finally gotten past the permit delays that had been running since October. He told Naya that evening. She asked how he felt. He said, like something had stopped. Not well or badly, just stopped. She understood that. The historical documentation Myung-soo had held, the 20-year accounting, was addressed in the separation terms with the specific legal mechanisms Do Hyun's attorneys had spent months constructing. It didn't disappear. That wasn't possible. It existed, had existed for years, and the actions it documented had happened. What the restructuring had done was ensure that the documentation's capacity to damage the current architecture was, as Do Hyun had told his uncle in the Seongbuk house, significantly reduced. The personal risk remained. He'd accepted it. He'd told Nia he'd accepted it, and she'd looked at him for a long moment and said, "Then we deal with whatever comes," and he'd said yes. Not a guarantee, a commitment to the shared reality of the risk. She'd found, over these months, that this was what it actually looked like to be with someone fully. Not the version where they promise you safety, but the version where they sit with you inside the uncertainty and don't pretend it's something else. In March, Park Hyun-tae contacted Do Hyun. Not through the anonymous account, directly, through an attorney in Lisbon, a letter that had been in transit for 2 weeks before Jae-won brought it to Do Hyun's desk on a Tuesday morning. He read it once. Then he called Nia. She came to his office. He handed her the letter. Hyun-tae was 61. He'd been in Portugal for 4 years. He had, the letter explained, spent a significant portion of those 4 years angry at Do Hyun, at the circumstances, at the organization, at the version of his life that had ended on a Thursday in 2019 without his participation. The anger had not disappeared. The letter was not a document of forgiveness. What it was a request. Hyun-tae wanted to bring his daughter from Seoul to Portugal. She was 26, working in finance, had no connection to anything that had ever involved her father's former employer. The relocation required documentation and financial support that the annual deposits, which he acknowledged in the letter he had accepted, didn't fully cover. He was asking Do Hyun directly because the letter said asking directly was the only honest thing left between them. Nia read it twice and handed it back. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Everything he asked," Do Hyun said, "and then I'm going to write him back." "And say what?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I understand why the anger hasn't gone away, that I'm not asking it to, that what was done, and I carry the full weight of that decision, and I'll keep carrying it." He paused. "And that his daughter is welcome to come whenever she's ready." Nia looked at him. "That's right," she said. Not approval exactly. Something more direct than that. Recognition. He wrote the letter that evening, at his desk, by hand. He showed it to Nia before he sent it. She read it carefully and handed it back and said, "Send it." He did. Hyun-tae's daughter arrived in Lisbon 6 weeks later. Do Hyun received one brief acknowledgement from the Lisbon attorney. No further contact after that, which was how it should be. Not reconciliation, not absolution, just a man accepting the ongoing cost of a decision and continuing to pay it because it was owed. They went to Jeju in April. Not to the villa yet. That came later and differently, and under different circumstances than either of them had consciously planned. In April, they stayed at a small inn on the eastern coast that Nia had found during a work trip the previous year, a place run by a family who had lived on that stretch of coastline for 3 generations and prepared food the way people prepared food when they were doing it for the people they loved rather than for impression. They walked on the mornings. The coast there was rocky and specific, lava formations that the sea had been reshaping for longer than anyone had been there to measure, and the sound of it, the particular conversation between the water and the rock, all percussion and patience, was the kind of thing that made human noise feel appropriately scaled. He walked beside her and was quiet in the way he was quiet now, which was different from the old silence. The old silence had been constructed, maintained, a thing with walls around it. This was just quiet. The natural silence of a person who didn't always need to fill space with performance, who had put down the performance and found that actual quiet was not the same thing at all. She walked beside him and felt the specific peace of being with someone where the silence wasn't a problem to solve. On the third morning, he said, "I want to bring you somewhere." She said, "Okay." The villa was 20 minutes from the inn, on a hillside above the water, behind a gate that Do-hyun opened with a code she realized he'd been carrying in his memory for 6 years. The building was the same as it had been on the day they'd stood in it and said their first vows. Stone and glass, low and considered, designed to make the view its architecture. The garden had grown wilder. The terrace where they'd stood was still there, looking out over the same water and the same sky, which were different every day and somehow always the same. He stood beside her on the terrace and looked at the water. "I've been trying to figure out what I wanted to say here," he said. "I've been trying for about 3 weeks." She waited. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I had 4 drafts, and they were all wrong because they were all prepared. And what happened in that boutique in November was prepared, in the sense that I'd chosen the ring and planned the moment, and it was wrong from the beginning because it was constructed. I was constructing something instead of being honest." He paused. "So here's the honest version." He turned to face her. She turned too, and the sea was behind him, and the morning light was the particular clean light of the coast. And he looked like a man standing in his actual life, rather than the managed version of it. "I don't need a perfect relationship," he said. "I've never been able to do perfect. I couldn't do it with you the first time, and I'm not capable of it now, and I'm done pretending that capability was ever the goal." He held her eyes. "What I need is this. Specifically, you in the same space as my actual life, the weight of it, the difficulty of it, all the parts I spent 3 years of marriage keeping behind doors. You knowing everything and staying anyway. You telling me when I'm wrong, which you will frequently, and being right, which you will be frequently." He stopped. "I want to try again. Not as the version of this I failed at before, as the thing we've been building for the past 5 months, which has been the only real thing I've been part of in as long as I can remember." She looked at him for a long time. The sea moved behind him. A bird passed over. "You still didn't prepare a question," she said. "I know." "Do-hyun, will you?" "Yes," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I hadn't finished." "I know, yes." Something crossed his face. Not the ghost of a smile, not the almost movement. The actual thing, complete and unhidden and not performed for anyone. She stored it somewhere she intended to keep. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that she recognized. Not from the boutique in November, not from their first marriage. Something different. She looked at it. "When did you—" "January," he said. "After the development meeting. I walked past a studio in Insadong." He paused. "It's made by a craftsman in Busan." She looked up at him sharply. "Not the one you use for sourcing," he said. "A different one, but the same neighborhood." His eyes held something that was quiet and certain and completely without performance. "I thought you'd appreciate the materiality of it." She laughed. A real one, the kind that started in the chest. She hadn't laughed like that since. She couldn't immediately locate the last time she'd laughed like that, which meant it had been a while. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it in the Jeju light. Hammered gold, irregular. The kind of piece that was honest about being handmade rather than pretending to a machine precision it didn't have. She turned it once on her finger. "It's right," she said. "I know," he said. She put her hand against his face, her palm flat against his jaw, feeling the specific warmth and roughness of him, the lived texture of a person she had learned and lost and relearned and was not going to let herself lose to silence again. He put his hand over hers. They stood on the terrace above the water where they had stood once before, younger and more frightened and less equipped, and the sea did what it had always done, and the light moved the way it moved, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already present in the standing there. They married in June, small, 13 people, Ji-young, who cried in the particular way of someone furious at themselves for crying. Haiwan, who didn't cry but was seen 3 times checking his phone and putting it away with the expression of a man who had just received very good news from 3 different sources. Do-hyun's brother, Sung-jun, who had taken to calling Nia Nuna with complete sincerity by now, and had given a toast that was both heartfelt and mercifully brief. Nia's closest friend from Atlanta, who had flown in 48 hours earlier and had spent most of those hours telling Do-hyun, in direct and friendly terms, exactly what the consequences of a second failure would be, which he had received with complete composure and told her, equally directly, that she was right to say it. Her mother came. She had not announced she was coming until she was already on the flight, which was entirely in character. She sat beside Do-hyun at dinner and spoke to him for 2 hours, and at the end of it she reached over and patted his hand once and said, "Better late than never," which was, from her mother, everything. The ceremony was at the villa. Terrace above the water, evening light, the sound of the sea doing its patient work below. They said things to each other that they had written themselves, without assistance, without drafts reviewed by anyone else. He spoke in a voice that was not flat and not controlled and was simply his, the real one, the one she'd spent years trying to find and had found in the end by not leaving. She spoke without notes, looking at him, and said among other things, "I know who you are, all of it, and I'm choosing it. I want you to know that it's a choice I'm making with my eyes open, not a compromise and not a settling. You're the hardest person I've ever loved, and I wouldn't change that." He was quiet afterward for a long moment, in the way of a man who has been handed something he knows the exact weight of because he knows what it cost the person giving it. Then he said, "I'll spend the rest of my life being worth that." Not a promise delivered for effect. A statement of intent from a man who understood the difference between saying a thing and building it, and had spent the past 8 months demonstrating, in action and in the accumulation of ordinary, honest days, which one he was capable of. That night, after the small celebration had ended and the 13 people had gone to their respective rooms in the inn down the hill, Nia and Do-hyun sat on the terrace of the villa alone. She had taken off her shoes. He had loosened his collar. The sea was doing what it had always done. The stars were the Jeju stars, which were not metaphorical or cinematic, but simply stars. The actual sky above the actual island, doing what it had always done without anyone's permission or narrative requirement. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They didn't talk. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had been said. Over months of honest evenings and difficult conversations and letters and terrace light and the patient work of 2 people learning to stand inside the same life without flinching. After a while she said, "We're going to fight." "I know," he said, "about real things, not the surface things we used to fight about." "Yes." "And you're going to go quiet sometimes," she said, "when it gets hard, and I'm going to have to push." "I know." "And I'm going to want to walk away sometimes," she said, "when I'm scared, and you're going to have to hold the line." "I know," he said. "I will." She turned her face up toward the sky for a moment. The particular depth of it above the coast, the stars in their uncountable and indifferent thousands, the whole vast architecture of things that continued regardless of what any 2 people decided to do with their lives. "It was always going to be you," she said, not sentimentally. As a statement of observed fact, the kind she made when she was measuring something accurately and wanted the number to be correct. "I hated that for a long time." "I know," he said. "Me too." She settled her head back against his shoulder. The sea moved in the dark below them. The night held its temperature. The villa that had witnessed the first version of their story settled around them with the specific patience of old stones that have held many things and are not finished yet. He tightened his arm around her once, briefly, and she felt in it the full accounting of who he was, the weight and the difficulty and the 15 years of hard choices, and the man who had stood in the rain so a stranger could stay dry, and the man who had written a letter to Portugal by hand because it was the honest thing. And she held it all, without simplifying it, without asking it to be less than what it was. Outside, Seoul was doing what Seoul did, 60 kilometers north across the water's darkness. Its lights, and its noise, and its beautiful, relentless forward motion. But here on the terrace, in the quiet that had been honestly earned rather than constructed, 2 people who had broken something and rebuilt it from better materials sat in the full, complex, specific weight of a choice they had both made with their eyes open. Some things find their way back because both people finally get brave enough to stop protecting themselves from the very thing they need most. The sea knew this. It had been saying it for longer than anyone had been there to listen. Now, at last, someone was listening.